Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have a whole group of people that I'm interviewing at once today, 3 different people. I have Dr. Mike Lehman. He's a soil microbiologist at USDA. I have Dr. Kristen Veum. She's a research soil scientist. And I have Dr. Veronica Acosta Martinez. She's a soil microbiologist and biochemist. So I hope that, with this many people, I'm able to ask good questions, and this won't be too much of an explosion of ideas, but, I'm game. It looks exciting. So thank you, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it. Mike, would you start with your bio first? And then I'm going to ask Kristen and then Veronica. So Mike, tell me a bit about your background and then your current work at USDA. What's it involved?
So I'm a research microbiologist, study bacteria that live in the soil. And particularly we're interested in bacteria in soils that are involved in agricultural production of food. So in our location, we look at cropping systems. And we are, in my lab, we're looking at soil microorganisms and what they're doing and what we can learn from them and how we can manage them in some way to reduce inputs and produce as much crop, produce as much profit for the farmers. So there's a lot of basic research in the lab that's involved in being a soil microbiologist. And so we do a lot of that, and there's a lot of learning to be done, and we do a whole lot of that.
That's great. Kristen, could you just give a brief bio of yourself and what are you working on?
Sure. So I'm a research soil scientist, and I'm in Columbia, Missouri. And if I had to boil my work down to 1 or 2 sentences, I guess I would say my goal is to try to simultaneously optimize agricultural production, but at the same time, optimize environmental protection. So those are 2 things that are typically at odds with each other. So it's a challenge to try to answer those 2 objectives at once. But I'm an optimist, so that's what I try to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, and Veronica, how about yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm a soil microbiologist and biochemist. Lubbock, Texas. It is Southern High Plains region, and it's a semi-arid region. I started working here in about 2001. It's about 20 years that I have been trying to evaluate the changes in the soil microbial component as affected by the complex interactions that we see with the climate variability that we have been seeing and the transitions in management that we also have experienced in this region. They can provide them just earlier indications of the changes in the soil health, in many functions that soils can provide, like recycling of nutrients, organic matter, transformations, and in the productivity of this region. So I have seen then the evolution, the transitions from cotton production to the incorporation of other crops that could be more drought tolerant, like sorghum, the integration of livestock production for this region to save some water, as we're seeing reductions in the water available for irrigation, and we're seeing also more frequent droughts. So we are also then going more into pastures and forages and changes then in this type of management. It's important that we then can help producers to select then what are the best integration of the management that they can do to cope with these changes that they are experiencing, reductions in the water, and that way keep our soils healthy and productive for future challenges that we will see, especially climate.
Okay, yeah. Kristen, if you would, can we start with a project you're currently working on, and then I'll ask questions based on it?
Sure. One of the projects that interests me the most, that I have the most fun with, is studying Prairie Reconstruction. So we're very focused on agriculture and how to minimize the degradation of the soil that comes from agriculture. And there's a lot of knowledge about what that trajectory of degradation looks like. But then, how do we reverse that process, right? And so if we want to take degraded ag land and return it to a natural system like a native prairie, what does that trajectory look like? And what aspects of the soil function can we reclaim? And right now I have a graduate student working on this Prairie Reconstruction project, and we have sampled prairies all across the state. And we're looking at just what's happened to the soil and how much of that function we can recover. And some of those results are pretty interesting.
This may be a really elementary question, but what is a plain versus a prairie versus, other names for, an area of the environment? What is a prairie? What makes why would someone call an area of, let's say, grassland a prairie? What makes it a prairie? What does that mean?
Well, you have tall grass prairies and short grass prairies, but it's really about the vegetation and other aspects of the ecosystem. So a prairie is going to be grasses and forbs. You're not going to have much in the way of woody plants. So here in Missouri, a lot of the former tall grass prairie that we used to have was prime agricultural land because it was fairly flat and it had high organic matter. So that's the land that was converted into agricultural production, many years ago. Now, maybe the others want to pipe in on different ecotypes that they have in their region.
Yeah, I would say that's a great answer for prairies. And then I would just add that plains, and my understanding is plains is a particular region of the United States. Like if you go west out into Idaho and Nevada, it's called the Basin and Range. If you go east, you get the Mississippi River Valley and you get the Appalachians. But here in the extending all the way from Canada down to Texas, that portion of the United States is known as the plains region, northern plains, southern plains.
Okay, yeah, I just wonder if it's just another word, is a plain different from a prairie, from something else, but okay.
Yeah, well, they are. Prairie is more about the vegetation, and plains is more about the geography within the United States.
So, Kristen, you said there's been a degradation of the soil. What is that only in places where crops have been actively planted? Is it because they haven't been rotated? Like, why has there been a degradation?
Well, you can end up with soil degradation for a lot of different reasons. If we're going to focus just on agriculture in this region, for many years we plowed the soil, right? So when you're disturbing the soil heavily with tillage, that turns the soil over, breaks apart the aggregates. It causes oxidation of that organic matter, that carbon that's in the soil. And, when that happens, then it's more susceptible to wind and water erosion. And then once you lose all that organic matter, there's just a whole sort of spiral of other things that happen. So the microbial community declines and the nutrient cycling declines. So a lot of things can come from that. And so on the agricultural side, things like keeping the soil covered with residues or increasing the rotational diversity, so the crop diversity, including cover crops in your rotation, and just overall reducing disturbance can improve that degradation process and hopefully reverse that or mitigate that.
Is there still a ton of monoculture going on? I guess there is. And is that a big reason for the degradation? Or,
sure.
Within agriculture only, what are the major drivers of it? How can you do agriculture right versus wrong?
Well, that's what we're all trying to study is how can you do it right? And what can we do to improve what we're already doing or what we've been doing for a long time? And so a lot of those principles that I just sort of tossed out there, reducing tillage. So maybe a no-till system if you are growing row crops. If you're not growing row crops, you can look at perennial systems, right? So a pasture system, for example, or some type of perennial crop is going to have roots in the soil and it's going to protect the soil and reduce erosion. So all of those principles, guys, what do we say those principles are? Again, it's reduce disturbance, which can be tillage. It's living roots, so that can be either cover crops or having perennial crops. Keeping that soil covered, which can be having crop residues left behind, or including cover crops when you would otherwise be fallow. And then bumping up that diversity. So having different extended crop rotations, or strip cropping, or intercropping, alley cropping, anything that increases crop diversity, or you can even add in livestock, and they call those integrated livestock systems. And so you've added an animal component.
Veronica, what project are you working on right now?
Well, I wanted just to emphasize how good it is to have these interactions of all of us, the three of us, because there are different regions that covers then different type of crops, soils, climate challenges in management selections in my region. As we're having this fast transition to dryland, as the water supply from the irrigation from the overall aquifer is diminishing, we're having all these frequent droughts, as I was explaining. One of the things that have been interesting in my research is that sometimes you have to innovate and think about what are these things that are just coming up that you need to understand that, like, for example, these frequent droughts, cycles like this. I then decided to then keep taking soil samples every year, as often also as possible, within all these producer fields and the research plots that we also have, and being able that way we could then see trends on how microbes are impacted, they crash, they are reduced by these frequent droughts, on these cycles of low precipitation and heat waves that we are experiencing. But it's also very interesting then to see how they experience a fast recovery. That resilience that we see is of ecological significance, to see that they can recover from this. So I also found that during these extreme conditions and these droughts, it was still possible to distinguish when producers have some management history of another crop that is possible to rotate with cotton, either sorghum or wheat. And that way we could still then detect greater microbial communities in those soils compared to soils that were under more monoculture and continuous cotton. So these things have been very interesting to see how is important the management, how the management matters, how we can leave some fingerprints there, some benefits that can be helpful for future events like this. So those are kind of like the projects that I could say that we have focused in here, evaluating alternative management for this region that could keep these soils healthy, but also how the management surprised on how we're really having these more frequent droughts and climatic variability that was predicted.
Who is the management up to? Is it up to the landowner, or is there also a local or state or federal set of regulations that governs what a given owner of land can do?
Well, like cotton production, this region, despite challenges that we could have on the extreme conditions of heat, low precipitation received, high wind, erosion that is experienced, this region has then even actually the temperature needed and the conditions needed for cotton production. So we are an important region for cotton production in the nation. And so we're one of the major cotton producing regions of the United States. And that will be then the main crop that is then produced. And it will depend then also maybe on the price and things like that. If they experience hail, then they go for sorghum, they try other crops, they're trying also to diversify. But this is up to the producer and if they have water, if they are able to irrigate, if they have to manage water, they may do other things. They may rotate. They may try to do more livestock integration, some of the producers, to also cope with the water needed. But we're also important for livestock production in the nation and for sorghum production.
I'll add that that's kind of an interesting question too, when you think about who's making those decisions on the landscape. And I think there may be some states where they do have rules that govern that. Not here that I'm aware of, but you have the landowner may not be the one that's producing the crops. And we have a lot of leased land. We have a lot of rental land. So the owner of the land could put something related to management practices in that contract. And they could potentially require that the person renting their land uses no-till, for example. I don't think that's very commonly done, but it is an option. But if somebody doesn't live there on the farm, and if they don't have plans for it to be, a family legacy, so to speak, then they may not be too concerned about what the renter is doing.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone seems to have mentioned tillage as a problem, but I mean, you would need to prepare the field before you plant. And then when the field's done, I guess you'd, again, till the field. How long does it take? I know it depends, but how long does it take for a soil to recover? And why is disturbing it? Why is tillage so bad? Maybe all of you can weigh in.
Mike, do you want to go first?
Well, I can go first. So just to clarify, we try and avoid the terms bad and good. And, a lot of practices that are being performed today have their roots for hundreds of years, or at least decades in certain parts of the country. And so that's important to consider in terms of the bigger picture. There is a fair amount of research that shows that disturbance of the soil disturbs the structure of the soil. And by disturbing the structure of the soil, you change the way air moves in the soil, you change the way water moves in the soil. Consequently, you also disrupt the soil microbial communities and their partnerships with the plants that are going to grow there. That said, there are probably locations in the United States or on someone's farm where, unless they till, they may not be able to grow anything. So it's not a one size fits all. Where it's possible to use no-till practices, it's been demonstrated by producers to be profitable, to be productive, and to basically save them money on inputs. I'm sure there'd be plenty of people who would like to argue those points. I'm just speaking from what is found in the research and what I know in our region. We're kind of on the edge of where no-till takes place. And if you go any farther east of us, then there's less no-till because the soils are moist. But even there's producers that use no-till and are very successful. So a couple things that are important is I think no-till does require a different way to handle weeds. And so there's no magic practice like everyone's got to be no-till or bust, or everybody's got to be organic or bust. There's a combination of practices that could be used to increase the health of the soil while retaining reproductive crops and good soils and good water and good air. And so it's important that we find this particular combination and provide demonstration of producers that can achieve these goals to improve everything across the board. But we can't say, hey, we got to apply no-till to everything. It does have benefits. It does have drawbacks. In some cases, no-till farmers tend to use more herbicide because they have to control plants without cultivation.
Question here. So when someone plants a crop in a field, if it's monoculture, I would think all the microbes and the fungi and everything would, either survive or not with that one crop. But I would think that the field would lose a lot of diversity, especially over a whole season. You just have corn, let's say, one particular type of corn. Then when the season's over, I know this is not exactly tillage, but if you're going to switch to another crop, would the field be in such bad shape from having only one crop that another one just couldn't grow there without substantial help? Like, how do you get a field after harvest back into shape to have a crop on it, even if it's the same crop or different?
Well, that's a question that's really at the heart of the science and research that we're doing at our locations, and my colleagues probably are doing at their locations as well. What's the legacy effect? But before I move on to that, I wanted to answer a couple questions about no-till. In research plots, people commonly think it takes about 5 years for the benefits of no-till to begin and the crops to be producing equally to tilled area. 5 years is often the amount. There was a recent study published by a group in Michigan State, that showed that it took about 15 years, actually, following conversion of no-till, to make up all the profit that would have otherwise gone into their coffers if they had stayed with tillage. So going from till to no-till often requires a big sacrifice of time and maybe less profits. But then once you hit that point, the tipping point, and then you start accruing a ton of savings. And so it is something. It's all long term. If you want to commit to one of these managements or a selection of management, long term is the way to recoup any loss that you might have with yield. And I think that's really an important point. So I don't know if you want me to keep talking about the other thing, but
well, and before you do, just to follow up on that, switching to no-till is not just as simple as buying a new piece of equipment and suddenly now you're a no-tiller. Any change to your management system affects just about every other decision that producer has to make throughout that season, and how they handle everything, when they plant, when they harvest, how they handle weed control. So, one of the things we try to do as scientists is try out different things to try to help them solve all of the downstream decision-making, questions and hurdles that are going to come up if they're going to make that switch. And sometimes they need to plant a different crop variety or something along those lines. So it's not a simple switch. But back to you, Mike.
No, I think that's a really good point. None of it's simple, and there's no one size prescription, even in one of our locations, because even at our location, our surrounding producers, each one may have a field with different conditions than the other one. Yeah, legacy effects. And that's exactly what, at least I study. That's probably the major source of our research work right now, is looking at the legacy effects. And we're in eastern South Dakota. Okay, so that's in the plains area. It formerly was a mixed grass prairie, tall and short grass prairie. They call it mixed grass, I think. And now it's a lot of corn and soybean. And you see corn, and then you see soybean. And occasionally you see some small grains. So it's not a monoculture, but nearly every farm out here probably has corn soybean rotation somewhere. And I'm guessing that's true in Missouri as well, and many points in between. And 2 crops is kind of a minimalistic rotation. And what farmers have long known for decades, well before we showed up, is that crop rotation has a lot of benefits, and preceding crop may benefit the succeeding crop. And where things changed was with the availability of fertilizers, mechanization and so on. And the markets now, farmers are going to respond to the markets. That's the first thing that's going to determine what crops are growing. And so we've lost a lot of the diversity in the crop rotations. And so what we are working on our research farm is we were looking at 3-4 year rotations that include small grains in addition to corn and soybean, as well as a few other crops like sunflower or peas. And what we're finding is that the crop diversity makes a change in the soil microbial community. That's one thing, how much diversity you have, but it's also important what the preceding crop is. And so we're looking at corn and soybean and the effects of preceding crop on corn and soybean production. And we find not only is the soil microbial communities changed in the root zone of these plants, but also if you have, let's say you have small grains in the rotation, then you tend to have higher corn yields and higher soybean yields. And this is due to having more crops in the rotation, and they are affecting the soil microbes, and the soil microbes are providing benefits to the crops that are being grown there. And part of it we think is a pathogen issue, whereas if you have just corn and soybean every year, corn, soybean, then you have a buildup in pathogens specific for corn or soybean. But if you break that with small grains or some other crops, then you're able to reduce the density of soil-borne pathogens. I think it's a really exciting field. These crop rotation effects have been known, since the turn of the century. But what hasn't been known is what the mechanisms are. And what we're starting to uncover is that the soil microbes might be the mechanisms behind these crop rotation effects. And so that's what I'm studying, and that's what I'm very excited about.
I mean, Mike, so we've gone through a little bit of your projects, Veronica, a bit of yours, Kristen, yours. What do you all think are some of the most important issues today, in 2021 with, understanding soil and crops and maximizing agriculture. I mean, has agriculture gone far enough where it's pretty well maximized and there's not much room to improve? Or is there still a huge amount of improvement to be had? And what is it?
Just wanted to double check. I just wanted to mention that as we are focusing here, that our research depends on the region and sometimes the specific challenges. In this region, for example, we have more water challenges. And when you mention about specific conservation programs, we have some that are related to water. Like then with the NRCS, we have a program that is EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentive Program from NRCS. It's our sister agency, the National Resource Conservation Service, in which producers sometimes are helped and assisted to change from center pivot irrigation system to subsurface drip irrigation. And that way it's a system that plays and adds the water below ground and can save water and reduce the evaporation. So that's another example of some of the programs that sometimes could be more specific for some regions. And it's one of the programs that we have seen more recently being used here by producers. So I think that within the research across regions in ARS, we have been able to help and assist producers with their specific challenges. And I see more and more then improvements in agriculture regionally also, with all the scientists distributed across the nation for improving the soil and crop productivity. It's one of our missions to be able then as a network to help improve the nation. I guess that one of the most important things here is how also the climate variability, as we represent also different changes and climate shifts and cropping systems shift across the nation. I think that we have success stories to really tell on how we have been able to design cropping systems that are more suitable for every region, to provide crop varieties that are more tolerant to climate variability, to heat and the drought stresses. And that way, then we have been able to provide not only that, but also technologies for water, also more use efficiency, and methodology also for metrics, for soil health indicators. And I think Kristen is also a person that have done a lot of research on methodology, validation of methods for soil health assessments, if you want to add.
Oh, sure. Well, so I think you were asking about sort of where we stand and if there's still room for improvement. And I would say we have a lot of really progressive farmers out there that are sort of leading the charge. And in many ways, they educate us about how things can be done and what can be accomplished in agriculture. But there are still, there's still quite a bit of room for improvement in terms of a lot of acres that are still under tillage, and perhaps, adding in cover crops and integrating some of these multiple soil health principles. And as we improve these systems, like Veronica mentioned, climate, we're going to have to be very agile and responsive in the future as climate variability continues to become a problem. So if we solve a problem in one location, we may have to find a new solution to a new problem in that same area in the future. So we're going to have to stay on our toes and keep doing our research so that we can continue to have productive agricultural systems. So I think that's one of the big challenges moving forward. And then in order, to do that and do that research really well, climate data is very high density, very intensive data. And so with all of these new types of data coming at us, we need new techniques to handle that data and to interpret that data. And a lot of that, there's a focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques, but, just figuring out how to unravel the complexity of these questions and being able to solve these problems now, but also in the future.
All right, Mike, go ahead.
I think there's improvements to be made in terms of adoption of, let's say, the best set of practices that could be adopted given the system and the equipment and the soil type and the climatic region that a farmer has. If we were to say, we'll take all that site-specific information, and if you could use these management things to make, work on your system and maybe improve it, if we could do that for the 95% of farmers that probably haven't adopted everything, it'd be huge, right? It'd be huge. And so right now you have a very small percentage of farmers that are probably using all the practices that are available to reduce inputs and take care of the soil and the water and the air. And it's not that they don't want to or they're against it. It's just, it's human nature, right? And in fact, it's a lot of work. I mean, the people that are adopting a lot of these practices, they're workaholics. Almost everyone I've met always seems to be always working. And so, there's a barrier there, and hopefully some of these barriers can be overcome. And our role here is to demonstrate it can be done. And part of what we need to do is have long-term experimental research field plots where we can demonstrate these things over a period of decade or 2 decades. So in this case with the crop rotation, we're looking at a 2-decade experiment. It's 20 years. And with the report on Notill I was telling you about, they did a big analysis, and the benefits of no-till really didn't start appearing until about 15 years after they converted. But then, and that was environmental benefits, profitability benefits, yield benefits. But after that, then they just snowball. They compound like interest in the bank used to. Yeah, I believe there's a lot of room for improvement. Maybe, it'll be a small percent per farm, but if you multiply that by the number of farms and the number of acres, you're talking about an astounding increase in efficiencies and less impacts on soil, water, and air as we produce our food.
Well, very good. I don't want to keep all you guys too long, but, Michael, Veronica, and Kristen, thank you for coming. What's the best way for folks that are interested, because there's a ton more here, where can they follow up? How can they follow up? Oh, is USDA website the best? Or, if someone's interested in soil and all the issues surrounding, again, tillage, soil, agriculture, et cetera, what's your suggestion for how they can learn more? Go to a USDA website, or where should they go?
Yeah, there's the USDA website, ARS websites, but also, Veronica, would you like to tell them about the story map?
We also recently developed what is called a story map for a soil biology group network that we have in ARS that the 3 of us represent. And we have in this story map a highlight of 26 of our soil scientists that are mainly soil biologists, but we have so many ARS scientists in the nation, just to always mention that. But it's focusing on the research that we do, how we, in our mission, is focusing on understanding the below-ground connections that drive soil health, harness soil biology, and support sustainable production for the nation, for the food, fiber, and fuel needed. So in that case, then, if you search for soil biology, ARS, I think it should come up. And we're also going to use it for our presentations, and we'll have it easily accessible in ARS. We provide a wide array then that way of local, regional expertise. We represent a set of data collection from so many years in ARS, techniques, research to enhance soil health. So we're committed to the producers in the challenges they have been facing today and for the challenges that we expect that are coming.
Well, very good. Well, all of you, thank you for coming on the podcast, and I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Richard.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.